right, so it's been a little bit.
It's been a minute,
Yeah,
as the kiddos say.
maybe 2 minutes.
At least they said it. They didn't say it back when we last made one of these. They didn't. They weren't saying it's been a minute yet.
Your kiddos.
Any kiddos weren't saying it that long ago. It's been a minute since they were saying it's been a minute, and the last time we made one of these was before that.
That's crazy. I feel like that's been a saying for a while.
Well, it's been 3 years.
Yeah.
It's not been a minute. It's been a year, or 2 or 3.
3.
Anyway,
yeah.
we kind of got off track. Well, with COVID,
Life happened.
We were doing these during COVID lockdowns and stuff, and then life got back to normal more, and we kind of got onto other things. And now, but we thought, let's finish it.
Yeah.
We made it all the way to Nehemiah. We might as well.
It's a good ways. I don't know exactly what the number proportion is between New Testament and Old Testament, but I feel like we're around halfway, honestly.
I think, we may be even more than halfway. I don't know. It'll be close.
Yeah.
Because, Nehemiah. Yeah, the Old Testament's certainly a lot bigger. So.
Yeah.
And it seemed like there were quite a few prayers, especially in Nehemiah. We've had several in Nehemiah.
And there's so many that we've been going through that I'm just like, man, I never would have thought of that as a prayer because it's not in like a formal structure like we'll typically do in church.
And that's the thing. So many of these prayers were more private, and that's these that we're looking at today are kind of more private.
Yeah.
It's really just Nehemiah talking to God. It's not. Yeah. He's not standing up in front of the whole congregation of Israel and saying a formal prayer like we had with Solomon at the temple dedication or something like that.
And it's also like I feel like whenever we have personal prayers, like I feel like there's always like a lot to unpack. There's a lot to talk about.
Right.
These prayers we've been looking at in Nehemiah are literally just he says his sentence, he gets it off his chest. He's like, God, do this. God, please remember this. Whatever. And then he moves on and he keeps going. I feel like that's very different from the private prayers that we have today.
Yeah, in fact, we're looking at one in verse 29 of Nehemiah 13 today, but before we get into that, there's one also in verse 31, so they're just 2 verses apart.
Yeah, so we're going to just pack those in together.
Yeah, we bundle them together sometimes when they're... And the one in verse 31 is literally only 7 words. I don't know how many... I didn't look at the Hebrew to see how many words it is in Hebrew, but in English, it's 7 words.
Yeah.
It's probably like 3 words in Hebrew, but yeah, so he just quickly gets to the point with some of these sermons.
Sermons?
I'm sorry, prayers. Yeah, well, sermons too. He got to the point with his sermons too. We'll talk about that a little bit.
Sometimes he got to the point so well he didn't even need the sermon.
Well, I mean, he cursed them and beat them and pulled their hair and all that. I mean, he was a different kind of preacher.
Oh, very true.
Can't get away with that anymore. I know a lot of preachers that'd like to. But last time, if you haven't seen it, it's prayer study number 102 on our site, on our YouTube channel. And so if you haven't looked at that one, you can look at that. But it kind of ended in verse 22. He has this prayer. He's wanting the Levites to help him keep the Sabbath day holy because people were coming in selling on the Sabbath day and they weren't doing what they were supposed to. And so he wants the Levites to purify themselves and to keep the Sabbath holy, and then he wants God to remember him for the good that he's doing in trying to get people to do what's right and take care of things the way they should. And that kind of leads us right into then what he's going to talk about in verses 23 down through 31, where he talks about the problems he was having, where nobody was actually purifying themselves like they were supposed to.
Yeah.
He commanded the Levites to do it, but they weren't.
And even like they're supposed to be like the best. They're supposed to be the holiest. And if they're not even setting that example for God's people, then And so it's interesting seeing like his leadership style where he's like, okay, we're starting with you guys because y'all are supposed to be the best. Right. And if you guys will take charge and do what you're supposed to be doing, then I'll be able to govern and take care of everything else much more effectively.
Yeah, leadership is so important. And if nobody's leading then it's just chaos.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Jesus even talked about seeing Israel as sheep scattered without a shepherd on one occasion, and that's the kind of thing that Nehemiah is trying to shepherd the people.
Yeah.
He's supposed to be the governor, or he's kind of helping get things going and keep things on track, and he's frustrated with the fact that those that are also supposed to be in leadership positions spiritually are not doing
slacking off, yeah.
Because he's supposed to be more, I guess, on the social and political side of things, the leader, but now he's having to straighten out the spiritual leaders because they're not being the spiritual leaders that they're supposed to be.
Right. Which I think it's very good that Israel during this time has a physical leader that is so spiritually minded.
Yeah.
Because I mean, with the kings, you saw so many times where it's like, they'd run their stuff, it'd be okay, but they didn't care about God. They wouldn't pay any attention to that.
Yeah, they were more worried about the physical than
sometimes that would definitely be a detriment where they're like, oh, idols, yay, kill your children, woo, and that would obviously cause some problems.
Oh, absolutely.
But so it's good to see a turnaround, even if it only lasts for a generation or whatever.
Yeah, every little bit of good that comes in a generation is a good thing.
Yep.
Wish it could last for multiple generations, but often it doesn't. Nehemiah didn't have any children to pass this on to.
Yeah.
So once he was gone, there was kind of nobody.
In some ways, like, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit. In some ways, I feel like once you have children, your effectiveness at reformation, especially in like a huge job, like he's running a small nation.
Yeah.
If he had kids and had to try and train them and keep up with them, who knows how effective he would have been at doing what God needed him to do to reestablish Israel.
Yeah, well, you see it a lot throughout the scriptures that somebody is either good at being a leader, or they're good at raising their kids, and it's really hard to. You don't have the time and the energy to do both. So you have a lot of times those that they were great kings themselves, but they didn't train their children.
Yep.
And others weren't that great a king, or weren't kings. They weren't in leadership, but they trained their children up. So.
And I wonder if that's why, like, part of the reason that God chose Joseph and Mary for Jesus. They weren't well known. They weren't famous. They didn't have a lot of
Clout.
Responsibilities. And so they could just focus more
on raising him,
being good parents.
Maybe so.
Interesting thing to think
about. Yeah. Certainly the choices that God makes. I know he said he chose Abraham for that very reason, because he knew that he would command his children after him.
Yeah.
And that was one of the reasons that he chose Abraham.
I think part of that was just because Abraham was older and already well established.
Yeah.
A lot of the kings and stuff, like, I don't know when they were having kids, but I've always felt like it was, fairly early on. And then trying to run a country and deal with the kids, and when a lot of times they're just running the country. They're not actually really involved in the lives of the children.
Yeah. Of course, a lot of people believe that Nehemiah was actually a eunuch. So not only did he not have kids, he could not have kids.
Right.
And that may be part of what frustrated him so much when he was seeing other people not doing what they could, when he didn't have a family of his own.
He's like,
and he's seeing them
I don't have this, I can't have this, you guys are blessed with this, you better use it right.
Do right.
Yeah.
So after he's talked about that in verse 22, with them not keeping the Sabbath day holy and trying to get the priests to purify themselves, in verse 23 then he says, "In those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod." Now Ashdod was the Philistines. They were the enemies of God. And they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. So here they are. They've got these foreign wives, and you know, somebody asked, well, wasn't Ruth, wasn't she a Moabitess? Yes,
but she was faithful.
Well, she said, "Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I'm going to become Jewish." Instead, these people had married these foreign women, and instead of bringing those foreign women to God, they had gone with them, so that their children don't even know the language. How are they going to learn the scriptures if they don't even know the language that the scriptures were in? And that's one of the problems that they have here. And so then in verse 25 he goes on, "And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair." We talked about that a little while ago.
Great sermon.
Great sermon.
Very motivational.
Very, very motivational. "And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, 'You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves.'" And then he tells them why. So he got their attention, and now he's giving them the sermon, right? "Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin." And so he points out the danger and the problem that they have, and gives an example from history. So then he goes on to say, "Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women?" And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat. Now, if you read Nehemiah, you'll find that Sanballat is one of Nehemiah's enemies.
Yeah.
And here, one of the priests, one of the guys who's supposed to be a leader, in fact he's the son of the high priest.
Which means he could inherit the high priesthood.
He could be the high priest next when dad dies. And he's married to the daughter of Sanballat the Horonite, who's a foreigner, a heathen.
Who didn't want the wall reconstructed,
didn't want the temple built. He's an enemy.
Yeah.
And isn't there a movie called Sleeping with the Enemy long, long ago? I mean, here they are. He's married to the enemy. And so he says, "Therefore I chased him from me." So he ran off the son of the high priest because he was corrupt. He had married outside
I think about how much trouble they've had that we know about with the high priest's children.
Yeah. Oh.
Like, even at the very beginning, the sons of Aaron. And
with Nadab and Abihu, and then you had Eli's kids. And then Samuel has trouble with his kids. And then you've got this case with this one.
And again, some of that's, you've got a large responsibility. You've got a lot to take care of.
Right.
You are providing sacrifices and religious services for an entire nation. Like, this is not,
This isn't just the preacher at the local church.
Yeah, this isn't even
the high priest over the whole nation.
Yeah, it's not, you spend a week, you write up a couple lessons, you present them on Sunday to a couple hundred people at even a large church. This is, you are in charge of sacrifices, souls, everything for
at different points,
a couple million people.
Depending on the point in time. Yeah. Even more than that at times.
And so you think about the level of responsibility and the amount of work that would have had to be put in, because you're also in charge of, obviously, the Levites directly under you.
Right.
So you're not just a religious leader, you're also a manager.
Right.
And you've got to make sure that everything's being done properly, the sacrifices are being performed properly, training of new Levites coming up is being performed adequately, and then you're trying to train and raise your kids on top of that to inherit the high priesthood after you.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It's a lot, and it's no wonder that we see so many of the sons of the high priest not living up to that high standard, because that's a lot to achieve for anybody. It's no wonder by the time it got to Jesus's day that it was just trading hands based off of whoever was paying for it.
Yeah, they're buying the position by that point. So a lot more trouble by then too.
Yeah.
It's when you think of that and you look at what's going on here, and he just I chased him away, ran him off, and then he has this fairly short prayer. It's just one verse long, and he says in verse 29, "Remember them, O my God, because they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites." Now, it was one thing, he talked about there were Jews who had married the women of Ashdod and Ammon and Moab. That was bad enough. But it specifically in the law commanded the priests and Levites were absolutely not to marry outside of Israel. They couldn't even marry a woman who had been divorced or a widow. They were strictly limited in who they could marry. So this was far from the plan. And so he says, "Remember them, oh my God, because they have desecrated the priesthood." By marrying a priest, marrying a foreign woman desecrated the priesthood.
And we were watching The Chosen last night, a couple nights ago, and they had a section where they were kind of one of the priests was reading from the Old Testament, and they were going through that section of "You shall not marry anyone who is from Moab or from an Ammonite," all of those races, because they did not show you hospitality when you were traveling up from Egypt. And I think just to like pivot a little bit slightly, it is so interesting to me how important hospitality is in that section. That is the sole reason that's given. It's not because they're a different race. It's not because this, that, or the other.
They didn't fight and try to kill you or something. It's just they didn't help you.
They didn't give you food. That's it. They didn't shelter you.
They wouldn't even let you walk across their land.
And and I think some of that is because their family, the Moabites, at least if I remember correctly,
kind of distant cousins.
And so
Ammonites too.
I
mean, those are descendants of Lot.
So I think that might be a point in there somewhere.
And the Edomites, the descendants of Esau.
Oh yeah, they were definitely brought in with that. But I think it's interesting. I've been so focused on the section around the prayer where the priesthood's actually mentioned. At the very beginning, I didn't notice that this isn't just about the Levites.
No, not just the Levites.
This is about everyone under his area. They're all being like this, and so that's something that's interesting, because I was just seeing the prayer section where the high priest and everything's mentioned, and I wasn't even thinking about the other tribes that are in there. And because of that, along with that, I think the prayer is a little bit more specifically targeted, which is what kind of distracted me from the other tribes being
he's
involved.
talking about the priesthood specifically and the Levites.
So the context there it's kind of interesting because it's connected, obviously, but it's not directly connected to the prayer, because the priesthood's only mentioned in that one verse.
Right.
All the rest of it is about
just the general
population.
But then you wonder, okay, so why were all these other people doing these things? Because that's the example they saw in their leaders.
Yep. And if they see the son of the high priest grows up respectable, marries someone outside of their nation, oh well, what's wrong with us doing it?
That's why when we look at the leadership in the church and what God commands for elders, the first thing he looks at is not whether the person is good at business or a good leader or political. Or what's he look at? How does he run his home? Mm-hmm. Is he the husband of one wife? Has he raised his children right? Mm-hmm. Those are the things that he's looking for in a leader. first take care of this, and then of course by the time somebody's an elder or of age to be an elder, their kids are usually grown and out into the world, living their own lives. But then they have time because they've raised their children. That's one of the reasons he doesn't want 30-year-old guys that have 10 and 12-year-old kids.
You're busy enough. You got enough on your plate.
That's not what he wants running the church. I know running the church, but leading the church.
Yeah.
That's not what he wants, because he's looking for somebody who's already shown they can raise children and take care of a home, because the church is God's family.
Yep.
It's not God's business. It's his family.
If you can't raise your kids right, how are you going to raise God's kids right?
Yeah, and that's one of the responsibilities of elders. And so that focus on that in the leadership in the church was an important thing. That's why, an elder is not going to be somebody who's married to a heathen woman and has kids who can't even speak the language of God's people.
Right.
That doesn't know how to talk about the scriptures or understand the scriptures. And so he talks about that very strongly. And so then he pivots just a little bit in verse 30 to what he did. He says, "Thus I cleanse them from everything foreign." So he gets rid of all the foreign things, all the foreign influences, because we're supposed to be God's people. And I wonder about that sometimes. How many of us in our own homes are influenced by foreign things, foreign religions even, that are outside of God's teachings?
Or even, we're not Jewish, even religions that come from the same ethnicity as us.
Yeah.
But aren't, directly from the Bible, and so it affects us. I've been thinking a lot recently about how our structure of worship, a lot of the things that we do and how we do them, has really been shaped and affected by Catholicism.
Yeah.
Or by, on the other side of things, a fear of appearing too Pentecostal.
Yeah.
And so...
or some of them as a reaction against Catholicism to try to be different than them.
Yeah, depending upon what the congregation is, what they've been influenced by, you'll have different things to deal with. And I've been thinking about that a lot recently, where it's like, why do we do this way? Mm-hmm. Why, the Bible talks about this, why don't we do this way?
It's always good questions to think about.
And to some degree, some of those you also have to ask, well, is it wrong that we do it that way? Maybe not. But I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of those things don't have to be done that way.
Is there a better way we could be doing it? It's always good to ask those things and try to find better things.
Because it's important for us to recognize that the Bible says our God is a God of order and not of chaos. But in that order, he has given us a lot of freedom to be able to determine things for ourselves as to how things can be ordered. Because we're made in his image, and having free will, we can order things to some degree as we would like them. And I think that's something that's important for us to realize in modern day religion. Another thing that strikes me about this passage and a lot of things in the Old Testament is how different that mindset is from, I won't say all American ideology, but a lot of American mindset, where we think of foreigners as, or other ethnicities as something that should be welcomed, something that should be encouraged. America is a melting pot of all different kinds of cultures and ethnicities, and even in America, one city is going to be different from another city just based on, who moved in there, who came from where, what did they bring with them.
Yeah, and whole regions of the country are different.
Yes, exactly.
They have different influences.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that, for the most part, I think we as Americans appreciate and welcome, even if we don't recognize that we're appreciating it. And so having something like this where they're like, no, foreign is bad, we don't, like, they would have outsiders for trade.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah, they had to trade with someone, but
and they would have some connections along those lines, but in a lot of ways, it was like, oh, you're not from God's chosen people.
Yeah.
We will not associate with you in these ways.
And a lot of that was something that God wanted of them.
Yes,
they were to separate themselves from the world.
And we are supposed to separate ourselves, just in a different way. And sorry, there's a cat running around.
The cat wants to get on camera too.
Yeah.
No. But no foreigners.
no foreigners, no cats.
No foreign cats.
No foreign cats. The hairless Egyptian ones. No, thank you. Those things are scary. Cats should have fur.
What about the Siamese, though? The Siamese cats. Ooh, they're mean. I was always scared of them from that. Was it like Lady and the Tramp? Oh, they were scary when I was a kid.
I think it's just the eyes, you know?
Yeah.
All right. Where are we?
So he talks about cleansing all the foreign influences, and he says, I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work. Mm-hmm. So he gets everything set up the way they were supposed to be doing it. They all had their different tasks. And I provided for the wood offering at appointed times. So he gets the wood for the offerings, makes sure that there's enough of it there, because they had to keep that fire going. They had all these sacrifices to make and needs a lot of wood. And I don't know if you've seen pictures of that part of the world. They don't have nearly as many trees as maybe we do here in South Georgia, or in North Georgia, in the southeast part of the United States. It's kind of a little more of a deserty type climate. So finding enough wood to keep those fires going was a challenge for sure.
I wonder how different the climate might have been back then, because you hear about like the cedars of Lebanon.
Well, that was right on the coastline up north, and I think they still do have trees there.
Some impressive trees.
But I think about certainly some of the along our western coastline, but obviously theirs is a little different around the Mediterranean. But and also then you think, well, how much of it was has gotten cut down with more and more people living in places and
I mean, because that was the land flowing with milk and honey. It doesn't really sound like arid land.
It doesn't sound like the land we see today, and it very well could have changed over the last couple thousand years for sure.
There's still some beautiful greenery over there.
Yeah,
but it's definitely a lot more sparse,
arid
than what we think of when we're thinking of a national forest, Yellowstone, something like that, where there's just trees everywhere, greenery everywhere. So that's very different. And I like that he says, and he provided for the first fruit offerings. So I'm curious how he did that, because from how it sounds, he's not just providing for himself. So as governor, would he have taxed the people of their first fruits and then donated that to the temple on their behalf? But then does that even fall under like their worship? Because then it's him just forcing them to follow God's laws. Their heart isn't in it.
Well, and part of that could be a translational thing. This other translation says, I appointed the wards of the priests and the Levites, every one in his business, and for the wood offering at times appointed, and for the first fruits. Almost like he's appointing which Levites and which groups are to do each task. Almost. Okay. So it could be
that I think makes
that he's providing workers to take care of the wood and workers to take care of the first fruit. He's just making sure that it's being done like it's supposed to, not that he's personally doing all of the work.
Okay.
And I think that could be what he's talking about there as well.
And then we've got his short little prayer at the end. Remember me, oh my God, for good.
Yeah. It's interesting. He has several times asked God to remember different people.
Yeah.
And
it's not always good. So I think it is interesting he specifies here, remember me for good.
Yeah, because he wants God to remember him for the good things he's done. Mm-hmm. He wants God to remember this
Sanballat.
Well, it's Sanballat and even one of the sons of Elisha the high priest, who he's not named. The son isn't named, but he's the son of Elisha the high priest, who was married to Sanballat's daughter, and he wants God remember them. So he kind of lumps all of them in together because they have desecrated the priesthood. Remember me for good. Remember them because they've desecrated the priesthood. He also wants, back in 22, he talked about God remembering him and sparing him according to his mercy.
Right.
So he's constantly wanting God to remember the people that have done good things, the people that have done bad things. Mm-hmm. And it's not like God's going to forget.
No.
But he wants to just say, yeah, God, remember this. Yeah. And sometimes when we're struggling, when people are fighting against what's right and we're trying to do what's right, yeah, sometimes we may feel like we need to say the same thing. Remember how much trouble they've caused.
Yep.
And remember me for good because I'm trying to serve you and I'm trying to do what you want done. Yep. And it was a struggle. It was an uphill battle for Nehemiah constantly. He had the enemies outside the camp. He had enemies in the camp. He had situations where there were lazy people who wouldn't build their part of the wall with like they were supposed to. He had all of these different issues going on. And now we know Nehemiah wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
But he was trying to do what was right.
Yeah.
He was trying to get people to follow God and do what they needed to do. So we need to learn that lesson. And yeah, don't be afraid to pray for God to punish the wicked for their wickedness, to punish those who are rebelling against him for that. And don't be afraid to ask him to remember you for doing good things if you've been doing what God wants you to do.
I think asking God to hear and asking God to remember in the Old Testament are very interesting concepts because we know he's going to. But I think it's also that concept of reminding ourselves of what he's going to do. Asking him to hear us as a reminder that he is always hearing us and that maybe we need to pay more attention to him in certain times. And we need to be crying out to him. And then also asking for his remembrance, even though we know he's going to remember, just so we can remember and we can keep those things on our minds. Because when people are not being the way that I think they should be, according to, whoever's standards, God's standards, work standards, culture standards, those are things that I tend to very easily forget about and brush under the rug. I don't really remember them until something gets really bad, really out of hand. And so I think praying for God to remember what someone's done, what I've done, is a good way for me to remind myself, well, what has that person done? Yeah. What have I done? And it's a good way to actually...
and what do I need to be doing?
Yes. And it's a good way to pay better attention to the people around you and yourself and what's actually going on here.
Yeah. All right, so this is the end of Nehemiah. We finished it out with that little short 7-word prayer. Good way to end a book, 7 words of prayer. I don't think we're going to have any from Esther. I think our next ones are probably going to be from Job, but
yeah. Job's going to have some interesting stuff in that. There's going to be a lot of things in there that I probably would not think of as prayers.
That's a very real possibility.
I think another good reminder as we're ending Nehemiah, is something that I need to hear, is prayers don't have to be long.
No.
I've always felt like if you don't have a lot to talk to God about, you're being disrespectful and you're kind of wasting his time. But that's not how God works.
Definitely not. And, here we see with he's not even, a lot of prayers you see, they're praising God, thanking God for everything. Mm-hmm. These short little prayers.
He's asking for one thing.
Just remember this.
And even then, it's odd how it's phrased because, we always think that, oh well, I should be humble, I should be asking God for this. He's just saying, God, remember. He's not saying, God, please, would you remember this? And I think
It's
that,
remember me, remember them.
and I think that's, balancing the humility in prayer with a boldness in prayer, that, God, let's do this.
I think somebody took these and made a song. Don't you forget about me.
I mean,
that's kind of what he's saying.
What was
Don't
it?
forget about
The Birds had Ecclesiastes chapter 3. For everything turn, there is a season turn.
Yeah, we should probably not sing.
No, probably not.
It's good this was at the end and not the beginning.
Yeah, people can skip this.
People would have turned it off and not listened to anything about the prayers.
All right.
But thanks for watching, and
we're going to be hopefully getting back on track with this, posting some more of these, trying to get through the rest of the Bible.
Yep. Yeah, we're going to try to do it a little more regularly than once every 3 years.
So those of you that watch and listen, I hope that we're able to stay more on track, and I hope that you enjoy and learn something.
I hope you're benefiting from this.
Because that's what it's for.
Bye.
Bye.